if that's dangerous. All right, I think I'm not always comfortable with these mics, so hopefully this will work out. Cool. Well, thanks for having me. I've been coming to FLN for the last, I think, 3 years, and it's been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot, and it's been great meeting a lot of you, all of y'all. Since for those last 3 years, I've been working at the Green River Game Lands, where the longest fire and fire effects study is established in the Southern Appalachians. This was established in 2000, first sampled in 2001, and so we just had the opportunity to resample that after a burn in 2024, right before the hurricane, and then we had another sampling in 2025 after the hurricane. So that was a perfect time to survey some of the change that Hurricane Helene caused to the landscape there. This is a very different system than what Dakota was talking about. Dakota was very high impact, high intensity, the most intense blowdown areas. This is the little wind gusts, so much less, the very lower end of the threshold. I'm afraid this talk is going to be a little bit, the title of this talk is a little bit clickbait. I bet you all coming out to see hurricane stuff, right? I'm going to talk about hurricane stuff, and there's some exciting stuff in there. Some of the stuff that Dakota already talked about. But I'm going to talk a lot about Miscanthus too, so buckle in. Those of y'all that know me, you know what to expect. So I don't need to go over the history of why fire is important in the mountains. We all know that. It was very common, declined with fire suppression, mesofication ensued, et cetera, et cetera. And so on the backs of all that, the Fire Surrogate Study Network was put in place in the year 2000. It was a national network all throughout the United States. There's 12 study sites all throughout the states to try to understand how fire and fire surrogate treatments would affect different forest conditions all throughout these different ecosystems throughout the country. And now, 25 years later, there's only 4 of those left. One in California, one up in Montana, one in Ohio, and ours down here at the Green River Game Lands, which is just an hour from here, which is kind of very special. And that's been kept alive by a lot of y'all, a lot of the partners who are very instrumental in keeping that going. And it is, in my opinion, I think several of us would agree, several of y'all would agree, it's probably the most important fire effects study in the Southern Appalachians, if not the East Coast. Don't want to underplay Ohio, but I think this one's pretty nice. So the study is right now from here in Polk County, North Carolina, just on the edge to where the mountains transition down to the Piedmont. So there's a lot of crossover there. There's mountain, it's in the mountains, but it's got a lot of effects from the Piedmont coming in there on the Green River Gorge. And the study was set up in a similar way that all the other studies were set up. Starting with a burn treatment where repeated fire was applied to the treatment units, a mechanical treatment where all the woody stems below 4 inches in DBH and all the shrubs were cut down to with chainsaws and just left to rot. A combination of the two that resulted in a little hotter fire because all those woody fuels were put on the ground and then burnt. And then, of course, a control just to see if the reference conditions change over time. They were arranged next to each other, variable different ways, but the burn mechanical and the burn treatment, the 2 burn treatments were included in the same burn unit. So they more or less received the exact same treatment conditions, but both treatments received the same treatment conditions. And in each treatment unit, permanent sampling plots were established. And how long did it take y'all to put those in, Helen? Is Helen here? No, she's not here. Well, she put all those rebars into the ground, and they've been there ever since. I know they're still there, which is great. And so there's about 10 plots in each treatment unit. I'm going over this because Chris is going to follow up with me. He did went over all this detail last time we gave this talk together, and so I'll give a little bit more detail here. So these are the vegetation plots. There's a couple more out there for fuels. But each treatment, in addition, each treatment with these points was repeated in 3 replicates, 2 on the north side of the gorge and 1 on the southern end of the gorge, slightly disjunct, with each treatment unit about 25 acres for a total of 300 acres. So this is about the area that we have data for at the Green River Game Lands for understanding how hurricane affected us and how Miscanthus is affecting it. But we'll stick with the hurricane for now. So I'm highlighting this because this is very different from what Dakota did. Dakota's talk 2 days ago was about a much broader region throughout the mountains, high impact areas. And here, this is a small sample. It's more of a surgical approach to understanding how how hurricane affected our landscapes managed with and without fire. So Hurricane Helene hit this area. Some areas pretty hard, some areas a little less. But to begin with, I do want to acknowledge some of the impacts to human property, human life, and people's lives throughout the mountains. This right here is just up the hill from on my road. This ridge is being fixed right now. The road is operational, but they're just getting to fixing that bridge now. So there's a lot of impacts from it. So because oftentimes we do sometimes gloss over that a little bit because I'm excited about some of the effects from Hurricane Helene in some respects, and you'll see why. Just a little overview. This site, specifically the Green River Fire Surrogate study, Green River Game Lands, received 15 to 20 inches of rain, about. It was exposed to 67 miles per hour gusts. That's compared to 90 to 100 mile per hour gusts up in the Black Mountains. And Mount Mitchell, I think, reported 104 miles per hour gusts. And then, of course, throughout the whole landscape, there was some extensive forest change. This is another picture from Choke Creek, just the national forest just above, at the end of our road. And this is some of the severe damage that Dakota was talking about. And you can see those areas right there received a lot of that. The Green River Game Lands, not so much. It was not quite that intense. Green River Game Lands looked a little bit more like this. You had more of these single tree to multi-tree gaps that created, some of the trees fell here and there. It was more of a scattered approach. But because we have all these plots there, and we had before and after data, we knew exactly which tree fell and which tree did not. And so we could really answer the question, well, how did the hurricane affect the woodland conditions that this fire surrogate study is trying to promote? The study was set out to better understand how, of course, how fuels are affected, how oak and pine regeneration is affected by fire or not using fire, but also how to create these woodland conditions that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. And data was collected in 2024 and 2025, and we collect, these trees are all tagged. So we know what species they are, we know what DBH they were, and what they are, how much they have grown. We also know if they've been alive last year, and if they've fallen the next year. And then I started collecting if they had a scar or not. It's just something I started collecting because I thought it was something that would be interesting, and I didn't know Hurricane Helene would happen, so this was quite incidental. So it's really just if a tree has a scar or not, no matter how large, yes or no. And of course, I didn't do all this work by myself. There's lots of students, undergraduates, interns that came out and helped us there. There's actually 2 students out there working right now at collecting another round of data. So that's really exciting to get another round of data. So to get some of these preliminary results, this is a trees per hectare. Sorry, these few figures are going to be in metric, but I'll switch over to imperial in a moment. So trees per hectare, really just trees per acre in DBH classes right here. You can see that there's kind of these 2 humps. The brown is trees that fell and trees that not fell. Overall, out of 2,241 trees, so 2,200 trees, only 118 fell at this site. So that's pretty minor impact. That's 5.3% of the trees. That's not a whole lot. Really not a whole lot of landscape. Again, single tree, single tree blowdown gaps. Some places were a little bit more extensive, but not really that much. In trees per acre and trees per hectare, you can see that there's these two humps right there. But that changes a little bit when you add basal area, where when you look at in the trees that fell in terms of basal area, there was a lot more basal area that fell in the larger DBH classes. So right around 15 inches in DBH, there's a lot more trees that fell as compared to the smaller DBH classes. They're, smaller tree has less DBH, has less of a basal area. And we look in terms of overall percentage of the trees that were actually downed, it's much greater. And so that goes along with that larger trees have larger basal area, and so more of the larger trees fell, which is something similar that the CODA was showing, that DBH was a predictor of trees falling. But everyone always then asks, well, what about proportional to how much of the trees that were there beforehand? And so each one of these essentially is proportionate to how much basal area there was beforehand. Does that make sense? And that's going to be the story for the next several plots as well. This is actually proportionate to how much there was beforehand. And so that pattern continues. More trees fell in the larger DBH classes. And I think that goes, I didn't need to tell y'all that. Y'all saw that out in the woods. I think everyone saw that out in the woods. But this confirms it. And it's great that this, the CODA and my work right here kind of coincide a lot. There's a lot of overlap, confirming stuff. But you can also see a little bit that increase of small DBH trees. They're going up a little bit. That's quite curious. We'll get into that. And so, knowing that large trees fell, the thing we're all interested in that the CODA did, how does this break out by species group? And so, again, proportional by species group, how much of that basal area was there beforehand. You can see below there, in terms for oaks, there was 78 square foot basal area of oak there before the hurricane hit. And so we kind of know how much of the sample size, more or less, it is. And so, quite interesting, oaks were the most likely to fall. Now, almost 10% of the oaks fell, which is quite a lot. Out of 5.3% of the trees falling overall, 10% of the trees fell in total. 10% of the oaks fell. Sourwood, similar to what Dakota was saying, had a pretty high percentage of trees falling. Does that make sense? Do sourwoods just fall in the woods? Not really. They're kind of small diameter. They're all just sideways, and I asked Dakota that question that was Tuesday, and they always grow sideways, and so they're just much more likely to be hit by a falling tree. Whereas a red maple, which also has a high probability of falling right there, maple maybe a little less because they always grow straight, and so they're not as likely to be hit by a falling tree. And so that's quite interesting. You got oaks and sourwood really taking home the greatest proportion of trees being down. Whereas the pines and yellow poplar and other trees not being as likely to fall there, or not having as large of a proportion of their basal area being down. And that makes sense with yellow poplar, right? It was a droughty year. A lot of them had lost their leaves already. And so that sail was more or less gone, or the wind stripped off the last couple of leaves, so they were not as exposed to falling. And then pines, I think the same story. They're a lot more resilient, that kind of system. And other, it's just a whole hodgepodge of other species in there. But of course, we're all interested in how does it compare between the different oak species? Because we had quite a fair number of oak species out there. And so I dug into that a little bit by oak species. And so this is where I think it gets really exciting for me. What you can see, right, if you look at oaks, 10% of the oaks fell. But out of the oaks, almost 20% of the scarlet oaks fell. And that's the most abundant tree there. So we're pretty sure this is not just a fluke. A lot of the scarlet oak fell. And that makes sense. Scarlet oak is kind of I don't know if this is the appropriate terminology, but it's kind of the early successional oak It's not as long-lived. Once it gets 100 years old, it starts kind of declining. It's a little bit more shallow-rooted. It's a little bit not as resilient to long-term growth. And so that was the first tree to go. The other red oaks right here, black oak and northern red oak, have a similar pattern, but not really too sure, because as you notice right there, there's only about 7 square foot base layer beforehand of black oak, and about 2% of base layer of northern red. So we can't really look at those. But the scarlet oak is interesting. Most interesting then is the white oaks down there, the chestnut oak and the white oak. They only have a 4 to 5%, only 4 to 5% of those chestnut oaks and white oaks fell. That's compared to almost 20% of the scarlet oaks falling. And so what I saw, when I was walking through Green River after the hurricane, I was just walking through, man, this is pretty amazing. There's a scarlet oak that fell here and there, but the white oak right next to it didn't. And so essentially, it's a self-thinning event of the species that we are trying to promote. So it's a shift from those more, quote-unquote early successional oaks, those scarlet oaks, towards the white oaks that we've been trying to restore. So white oaks and chestnut oaks are a lot more resilient, they're a lot deeper rooted, they're a lot longer lived, they're a lot more adapted to these kind of conditions. And so the hurricane helped us along a little bit in some ways by throwing, taking down some of the scarlet oaks and promoting some of the chestnut oaks and white oaks. I think this is pretty exciting. And so, digging into a little further, you can just first look at this, seeing how on the y-axis you have the probability of trees downed, and on the x-axis you have by deviation. We already saw this in DVH class, those charts there. Larger trees were more likely to fall, had a greater probability of falling. Once the tree hits about 15 inches in DVH, it tended to be more vulnerable to the wind. But also remember, I collected scar data. And so you can actually look at this in two ways. That trees with scars were also more likely to fall. You see how the black line is slightly higher than the green line? If a tree had scars, it was vulnerable at the base. Either it had scars and there's some rock that started to form, or that rock started to impact a certain root, or something like that. It just weakened the tree and it allowed it to fall. Here's a good example. This is a pretty severe scar. Of course, that tree is more vulnerable, but there's lots of other smaller scars out there. So scars was a pretty big predictor of trees falling. And of course, that only occurs in the burn treatments. In the unburned treatment, there wasn't really that many scars at all, right? So when you look at it by treatment, the fire and fire surrogate treatments, you can see that the burn and the two burn treatments, burn and burn mechanical, saw a greater probability of trees falling. And a lot of that is likely due to them, being scarred. And you'll also notice that the burn mechanical treatment had almost a slightly higher probability of trees falling. And that I haven't really gotten to the bottom yet, but I think that is because the burn mechanical treatment burned a lot hotter, so more of the trees fell. It has a smaller basal area, lower basal area, and therefore some of the trees might be a little bit more exposed to the wind, but they're also more scarred. They got larger scars. But whereas in the mechanical and the control treatment, not as many trees fell, probably because they didn't have as many scars. There's lots of other things that play into that as well. All right, we can look at these kind of charts all day, and it's exciting, but there's a lot of better ways to look at, more visual ways to look at how these species composition, or how the structure of these woodlands change. When we look at Green River, there's a picture from Green River, one of those sites that I think has been restored pretty well. You have that open canopy structure. This can actually be visualized with a stocking chart. Y'all familiar with stocking charts? I think Don talked about it last year, and I think I talked about it at another workshop as well. But stocking charts they don't get used as much anymore, and that's definitely not as much in hardwood management, but they're a way to essentially figure out how densely stocked, how dense the stand is. So, You can see these two gray areas right there, and then on the x-axis, on the y-axis and the x-axis, you're essentially plotting trees per hectare, or trees per acre, on the x-axis, and basal area on the y-axis. And you can take any kind of stand that you've sampled and just put a dot for, let's say you have 150 square foot of basal area for a stand that has 150 trees per acre. I need to retrain myself there. 150 trees per acre. And that would plot right somewhere around there. And that's about 100% density. And so that stand has as many trees that it has in it at that basal area as it can have. You cannot add any more. If you add any more trees, trees are going to die. Or they can't, trees are going to die, or they're going to have to fall. If they're trying to grow, you're going to have lose some trees. And so that is 100% stocking. But if you drop that stocking down, you decrease the number of trees per acre, or decrease the amount of basal area, you essentially decrease the stand and stocking. You're losing, the stand becomes less and less dense over time. And so the lower you get in there, the more you get into the realm we get in open woodland. Because the less dense the stand is, the more open the woodland, the more open the stand is. And so once you get down to the 60% stocking line, you essentially start to get the condition for an open woodland, where the tree, there's the smallest number of trees on the landscape that can still fill the canopy completely. So you have a large tree that's been able to expand and grow and fill all the gaps. Once you lose some trees from that, you start getting an open woodland. And so this is a good measure to understand how Green River really looks. And so I went ahead and plotted all the data, all the plots from 2024 before the hurricane on this stocking chart. And you can see, first thing, they're not all the same. They're all over the place. But you can somewhat see that the yellow points and the purple points, which is the burn and burn mechanical, are slightly more down here towards that woodland, towards those woodland conditions. Whereas the unburned treatments are a little bit further up. And you can see this a lot better if you plot the means, the averages. And so the burn, the mechanical and the control are right up there towards 100% stocking. So those are pretty dense, and they're just increasing in density as time goes on every day. But the burn and the burn mechanical treatment are down there towards the woodland margin. And so now we're curious, how does this look after the hurricane, after Hurricane Helene? And so they're all just shifted down towards that woodland margin. So the act of Hurricane Helene, those 50 to 60 mile per hour gusts, just got enough of the trees to not completely damage the entire forest, but selectively throw down a couple of trees here and there that just facilitate some of our woodland objectives in some ways. And with the scars helping out there, more of the scarlet oaks were hit, and a little bit more of the white and chestnut oaks were promoted more or less. So not only did we shift towards a woodland structure, but we also shifted in the right species composition. And so to take this slightly further, trees fell, and so when a tree falls, what's going to take the gap? Any tree that's already established, right? And that's usually the mid-story trees. Mid-story trees around the area are, we were talking about it all day yesterday. Red maple, poplar sometimes in there, black gum, sourwood. Sournut is actually not in this figure, but you can see that in the in the control, the unburned treatments, mechanical and the control, there's a much greater basal area of those mesophytic species. Those mid-story species we're trying to get rid of. And so even though there's trees that fell in those unburned treatments, those gaps are going to be taken up by mesophytic species. So we're essentially accelerating mesophication in those unburned treatments. In the burn treatments, burn and burn mechanical, where fire had been essentially brought into the landscape 5 times over the last 25 years, there's much less of that mesophytic basal area. Much fewer maples, mainly is what is in this figure. And you might think, well, the burn mechanical treatment, it looks the best, right? It was burned hotter, much more of that basal area is gone, those metaphytic species are gone. That's true. There's much fewer of those are going to take the canopy, go into the canopy. But this is somewhat deceiving, because yes, there's lots of those metaphytic species in the mid-story that seem like they might take those gaps now, that might be able to take advantage of those gaps, but really a lot of those small trees are actually scarred. They're not going to live that long. A maple that has a scar at the base, eventually it's going to get a certain size and it just won't support itself because it can't really repair itself as quickly as an oak can. And so both the burn and burn mechanical treatment actually have a benefit in preventing this hurricane from furthering mesofication. So that's a really cool story, and this is the similar story that went on in a lot of y'all's burn units throughout all the landscapes. So burning helped this hurricane not accelerate mesofication, or at least slow it down. So, Helene takeaways. Scatter blowdowns open the canopy, more in the burn treatments, creating those open woodland, or furthering our goals of creating an open woodland condition. Oaks have the highest blowdown rate, particularly shifting towards those white and chestnut oaks. Scarlet oaks fell, with white oaks and chestnut oaks being left behind. A positive shift in our species composition. Burn treatments had a little higher blowdown rate, which specifically helped us shift the conditions in those treatments where we're trying to restore, and also helped reduce the amount of mesophytic basal area of all those maples, shade tolerant species. And then lastly, the unburned treatments, it is accelerating mesification. Slightly less than I think in some of those severe blowdown areas that Dakota talked about, but still to a smaller scale, mesification was accelerated. And so, enough with the fun part. Disturbance kind of sucks sometimes because we have some awesome results, like we just talked about, but disturbance also brings in lots of non-native invasives. And while we all know that, we often think about some of these common culprits. We all have been in some of those blowdown areas where there's just tree heaven coming up everywhere. There's bittersweet coming up where there's never been any before. And it's just sad. Among all the invasive species, all the oaks that might be coming up, there's just all these non-native invasives. So, we think about tree heaven, bittersweet, privet in some places, but I'm sorry to say that there is a new kid in town that is starting to be on the radar for some folks up on the mountain, and that is Miscanthus. If you're not familiar yet with Miscanthus, don't leave yet. It's the exciting part. he's trying to get out of it. So Miscanthus, I started calling Miscanthus because there's a lot of different common names around it. Y'all have heard, some of y'all at least have heard me give this talk in some aspects. This is a little bit of an update in some ways. But Miscanthus is known as Chinese silvergrass for a lot of folks. If you live in Madison County, you call it pampas grass or grassoline, Madison County wildfire grass. If you picked up some of those flyers up there, Madison County wildfire grass. Eulalia, which is an old Latin name. So those are all names that this grass is known by. But Miscanthus, which is what I'm going to start calling it just to overall, it's like a common name to me, is from East Asia, all the way from the Koreas down to Indonesia, but throughout China and Japan as well. And it was brought here in 1893 by the Biltmore. They wanted to import a bunch of really nice, flowering landscape plants that they could, sell to landowners throughout the landscape. So we can thank the Biltmore for importing this plant for us. And actually, yes, it was the Biltmore that imported it to the United States, into Ashland. And the grass is really known, it's an aggressive bunch grass, but also produces hundreds, if not thousands, of little tiny seeds that are wind dispersed that are known to travel you know, a quarter to a mile, a quarter mile to I think it was a quarter of a mile to 2 miles has been reported to travel. So they can disperse long distances. And the Biltmore, once it acquired that new friend, it started actually selling it in its nursery. It started selling it as a landscaping plant for $1.50 for 15 plants, which is pretty good, right? If you go to Home Depot these days, it's $20 for a pot of Miscanthus. I don't know if I want to spend that money these days on it. I might have done this though. And so they started selling it far and wide, and it started being planted as a landscaping plant all throughout the United States, but particularly in the southeast. And some of y'all might recognize this view right there, but I like to give credit where credit is due. It's all over campus. Nothing we can do about it. I think this is someone else's game, but at least there's no Miscanthus going to be planted in the new forestry building. We made sure of that. And so from Asheville, really, Miscanthus started spreading all throughout the East Coast. And as I know, it's bad in Kentucky. I've seen it in West Virginia. It's all around the East Coast. But we know it in this region from hanging out in power line right-of-ways and road right-of-ways. It's all up and down 40. And a friend of mine said, he's a forester, he said, oh man, it seems like Miscanthus is just all along 26 and 40, and it just gets off at each exit and populates in the area. And that's really what it feels like. It just, from those rows, it just spreads into different areas. And so this is a smaller road. This is actually next to Green River Fire Service study. A little preview there. But it forms these really dense stands in these power line right-of-ways and in these road margins, because that's where there's a lot of light that hits the forest floor. And it keeps getting the disturbance, all the trees get sprayed, and so Miscanthus can colonize it. And this is not good, right? It's out-competing all the native species. It's a dense stand, very few native species can compete with this. So that's not good. The other part of it also burns really well. So this was a prescribed burn with a subflourish PVA with Zach several years ago. And this was on a not so good of a burn day because the neighbor was a little bit worried about fire, and so wanted to be extra safe. And so this is a head fire right there, if you didn't recognize it. That's about 6-inch flame lengths if we're being generous. But then as soon as it hit the Miscanthus clump, and this is one Miscanthus clump, the flames shot up to 15 to 20 feet. Just one Miscanthus clump. And so now you imagine a whole field like this on fire in the fall or in the winter or in the spring. And that's something that happens quite frequently in Madison County, just north of Asheville, the county just north of Asheville, where Miscanthus is so abundant because of early introduction, cultural burn practices, of farmers burning their pastures and things like that. There might also be some other things involved, but cigarettes, crack. But it's increased the fire severity to the point where there is a greater number of wildfires that occur in the places where there's Miscanthus. And there is, the fires are also getting larger because you can't catch these fires anymore. My friend Bo Dossett, who really put me onto some of this research, says you just wait until the Miscanthus fire gets into the oak litter, and that's when you catch it. And so the problem with that is, well, actually here, let me show you what it looks like first. He sent me this a while ago. And so that wasn't a head fire. That was just a flanking fire. They've said, 50-foot flame lengths easy on some of those head fires, or more. And so the problem with that, once you have all this, you gotta wait for it to get in the oak litter, it kills a bunch of trees because our native vegetation just is not adapted to this hot fire from a non-native grass. And so when Miscanthus burns, this is an entire field of Miscanthus. If you couldn't tell, that burnt just the year before, resprouting. And in the process of burning, it killed all that overstory trees. Of course now, it being a light-dependent grass, you can see it all establishing under there. And actually it was there beforehand already because there was just enough light, but now it's doing really well. And so next time it's going to burn, it's going to burn up all these trees as well. And so this kind of process is actually not so unlike what this plant does in its native range. In Japan, there's a lot of research on Miscanthus in Japan. And so this is an aerial photo of Mount Aozo in Japan. Note the scale bar right there. This is hundreds to thousands acres of Miscanthus grassland. Some of it is dominant, some of it is mixed in with other canes and other species as well. But it's quite dominant in this area. And the Japanese like to burn this as a cultural landscape. It's important to them that they keep this as a Miscanthus grassland. So every couple of years they go out and burn it. You know, this is pretty pretty large flames. It doesn't quite look like it from this distance, but it's quite intense. I really want to go and just light that up. We could probably all take a field trip and just all ring around the mountain and just light it up. It's pretty fun. Yeah, make a volcano. Make a volcano. And so this kind of cycle is known as the grass fire cycle, where you have fire that occurs, and the occurrence of fire makes the conditions for Miscanthus to establish, because Miscanthus does like those highlight conditions, the mineral soil. And so Miscanthus establishes on site, and then from that first introduction instance, it can then start spreading from locally. And with each successive entry of fire, you essentially increase the dominance of Miscanthus, because each new entry is able to spread. And so the more and more spread happens, the dominance of Miscanthus increases to a certain threshold where the dominance is so high that it changes the fire frequency and fire intensity. It changes the fire regime. We have a certain fire regime in the Southern Appalachians. Usually low intensity fires for the most part that are between every 3 to 25 years. I know above that, but if you have Miscanthus in there, that increases drastically, and the probability of ignition goes up, the intensity goes up. And so that is known as the grass fire cycle. It just goes round and around. And so the reason I'm talking about this, because this is already happening in the Southern Appalachians. In Kentucky, in a 2010 wildfire that burned pretty hot in some places, they went back 6 years after the fire and found Miscanthus in 19% of the plots. If you have permanent plots, you go back, right? So they went back 6 years after that, so 12 years after the fire. How many percent of plots do you think it was in 12 years after the fire? 75? Oh, you've already seen the presentation. Okay, well, you're pretty close. 73? So that's almost quadrupling the number of plots. And most of the plots this was found in was high severity plots, but initially, at least initially, but then it quickly spread from there. And so that is something that is, occurred elsewhere in wildfires, like in Laneville Gorge, there's a bunch of Miscanthus, there, Dobson Knob has a bunch of Miscanthus. So why do we care in prescribed fire? Well, prescribed fire really is just a wildfire. It's just a managed wildfire. But we can design a little better. But the problem is that Miscanthus does spread into some of those units with open woodlands. But before I get into all that, I just want to highlight the success that we've had with restoring some of these woodlands. This is a picture from the Yellow Branch unit a couple years ago. Created some of those great open conditions where you have some light reaching the forest floor, lots of goldenrod and other forbs. I saw some big blue stem in there, lots of dicantheliums. Yeah, there's lots of those in there too. But really great success. Another example that I think was highlighted early on as one of the first successes of the FLN, the serpentine barrens. That is incredible sight. The herbaceous layer underneath, the woodland structure is incredible, and the active management that has occurred here is absolutely incredible. The rare species that thrive because of that is unparalleled. DuPont State Forest, incredible pitch pine, rock outcrop, herbaceous understory of plants, really restoring really well. And of course, the Green River Fire Surrogate study also has incredible success. Some of those places are incredibly diverse. So many forbs and different grasses. You have milkweeds that are benefiting from this. lots of different grasses, legumes that we saw yesterday. We saw this plant yesterday at Helene's stop. Sunflowers, morning glories, orchids. I don't know if you all saw this orchid was actually on the trail that some of us walked yesterday. It wasn't quite in flower yet, but it was there. It would benefit from some fire. And of course, deer turkey really benefit from that. But above all, in some ways, there's been a lot of success in the partnership and the collaboration with everyone throughout this room to bring fire on the landscape. I was trying to tally up the numbers of how much landscape was burned. I think it was like 30 to 40,000 or something this year, and of course that was drought. But I think 3 years ago, it was above 80,000 acres or so. Did I get that right? I think 3 years ago or something like that. It was, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's a large amount of landscape that was burned, whereas 25 years ago, it was only, maybe 1,000 acres or so, right? Something along that. And so there's a lot of success that's at stake. And so my goal is to talk about Miscanthus because it is somewhat threatens that success if we don't think about it now, because it can get quickly out of hand. And so here, this is a site at the Green River Gamelands in the Fire Surrogate study in Rep 1. If you were at the workshop this spring, at the Duff in the Mountains workshop, we walked really close to this spot. Probably one of my favorite spots in the entire place. Super diverse understory, lots of different flowers and grasses, etc. But if you have keen eyes, you already spotted some of the Miscanthus in there that has established. And that is pretty typical throughout some of through the Fire Surrogate study. And so when I was starting my PhD with Don Helene at Clemson, I had just started my master's. I just wanted to look at the site, and I saw a Miscanthus or two. Like, I'm going to take a snapshot of this and post it on my naturalist, and maybe Jonathan McCall will see it. That's what I do when I'm in the woods. Oh, there's Miscanthus. Let me just, put it on INAT. But then I found another one or two. He's like, okay, cool. Maybe I'll do a 100% cruise. I'm just going to walk all 300 acres and look for Miscanthus. Can't be really that many, maybe a couple dozen. So I walked all burnt treatments right there and all the unburned treatments to see if there's any of the unburned treatments. And I think I didn't really know what I was in for, but I found around 400 Miscanthus clumps throughout 300 acres. And I don't think I need to tell anyone or do stats on this to know that Miscanthus is in the burn unit and not outside the burn unit. There's a couple. There's a few right there. There's some along the trail. Those are mostly along tip-up mounds where there's lots of mineral soil exposure, a little bit more light. But most of those are on the burn unit. I did stats anyways, because that's what you do. Confirm it so that folks trust you or distrust you. I'm not sure how that works. Miscanthus clumps per acre. So you can see the burn treatment have about a clump per acre, whereas the unburned treatment have negligible amounts per acre. 0.1. I think that's just an average. It's clear that burns really result in more Miscanthus, even prescribed burns. And so I wanted to dig into this little more. I hope I'm still good on time. 15 minutes.
You're
I can
making
take
up for lost time here.
I'm making up for lost time. Yeah. Talked too long about herds and stuff. So using those 400 or really 382 Miscanthus clumps, I dug into that a little bit. Where are they really established? What kind of conditions in the prescribed burn units or outside the prescribed burn units makes them more likely to establish in those places? Because if we're trying to understand how we can maybe mitigate some of this situation and preempt some of our prescribed burning and some of our treatments throughout the landscape, we really want to know where these established. Because I couldn't really find a true solid pattern out there. And so using that and 400 randomly generated points for logistic regression to figure out the probability of Miscanthus establishing, there's a couple things I included in the model that would essentially explain in what kind of conditions Miscanthus prefers to establish itself. And this is specific to Green River. So one of those variables was canopy openness, derived from a LiDAR. So this was from the 2017 LiDAR data. So essentially, where is there open canopy and where there's closed canopy. Heat load index, which is really just a measure of probability of high fire severity. And so it's like a high heat load index are those steep southwest facing slopes where there's more drying over in the afternoon and fire intensity tends to be a little hotter. The slope standard deviation, and this is a little convoluted, but when I was walking out there, I noticed a lot of Miscanthus clumps sitting right at the edge of upturned stumps. This is a slope map right here, and you see those little green dots right there? That's where a tree fell, created this mound, and created a flat spot. And so around those tip-up mounds, there's a lot of mineral soil that just kind of collects and sits for years before it revegetates. Sometimes it even washes down the hill from heavy rain. There's like not a landslide, but like a wash of mineral soil across the leaf litter. And so these sites, I noticed a lot of Miscanthus establishing at these sites. And this standard deviation really is just a measure of how variable is the slopes, how much does it change. And then distance to source population. I knew where there's some source population because you drive by them to the site. But there's also other ones you could only figure out from, you kind of get an idea of where you can expect these, and using satellite imagery from April is usually a good time to check that out. You can look at power line right-of-ways and see where it is at. And so I pinpointed some of those sites, and then drove by them in the winter, and sure enough, there was Miscanthus there. And so distance to source population, how far each clump is, or each one of those points is to the source population. So to get into that, we already know that fire increases the probability of Miscanthus to establish. And so you'll see that throughout the next couple of plots, that the orange line is going to be higher than the black line, meaning that Miscanthus is more likely to establish, has a higher probability of establishing if an area is burnt, and less likely if it's not burnt. And so with canopy openness, these plots will have the probability of Miscanthus establishing in percent, and then the x-axis will change right here. Canopy openness is the first one, so that's pretty clear. The probability of Miscanthus increases with canopy openness. So when the canopy is pretty closed and unburnt, there's very low probability of Miscanthus establishing. But once you increase the canopy, the probability of Miscanthus increases because you've got more light. You've got a little bit more light to facilitate the growth of Miscanthus. And this all gets quite a bit higher with in burn treatments, going from 25% in closed canopy to 80% or so in completely open canopy, no canopy at all, like that shot I showed you. Remember my favorite spot there. And heat load index, again, the measure of surrogate for fire severity. The spots that have a high probability of receiving high fire intensity also goes up with the probability of Miscanthus. So the more southwest facing a slope is, the higher the probability of Miscanthus establishing. And that's not necessarily a function of, just because of the southwestern slope, Miscanthus doesn't really prefer that. It would just as well establish on a northeast facing slope. That's really nice, dry and cool, nice, moist and cool. It's really just a function of fire severity. It just kind of correlates with that. It also prefers those tip-up mounds and those road margins. So if you have the tip-up mound, like I showed that picture, that just sticks around for a long time. And those two or three clumps that were outside of the burn unit, those were actually along those roads or on those tip-up mounds. It wasn't just in the middle of the woods, just anywhere. It was at those specific locations. And so mineral soil exposure does increase the likelihood of Miscanthus establishing. And so this, I think, here is what ties us to Helene. Because what did we just have? We had insane blowdown across the entire region. And in places where I've been on the Mountain Sea Trail above the Blue Ridge Parkway in the deep woods, and there was one small clump of Miscanthus under the dense canopy. That wasn't doing well. I bet it's doing well now. I really want to go back to it. I haven't made it yet, but it might be hard to get to. And so we have created a lot of conditions that correlate with this. And so, especially with now it being hard to fight fire, in these conditions where you just have jack straw where a dozer can't get through anymore, fires are just much larger. So you essentially, instead of having the unburned curve there, you just increase it a little bit more. And so, lastly, but most importantly, Miscanthus declines with distance to the source. So the further a location is from a source population, the less likely, a seed is likely to land in that spot, which just makes a lot of sense. But I think it's important to show that, especially since Miscanthus can travel long distances. Again, it's not unknown for Miscanthus to travel a quarter mile, although most of the seeds land within like 10 meters. And so, I think tying this together is a photograph from Carson yesterday from the Green River watershed. This was a close canopy until about a year ago, and then Helene blew down, and then the wildfire came through. And so this one clump, and I believe Carson, correct me if I'm wrong, this is on the edge of a road.
There's an interior road nearby.
Okay. Like there's like a little bit of mineral soil there where it rolls off. But this essentially ties in all those figures I just showed much better than the figures do. This area was burnt. It's open canopy, lots of light. The distance from source is quite far, but it can still establish. And now this is the source. And so now this spot can essentially disperse all into this entire area that is ready to receive Miscanthus seeds. Each one will be the next population. So that's kind of scary for me.
Is that Colonia?
Yeah, that's Colonia. I didn't see it either, and then Carson pointed it out. And so what can we do? Before we burn, survey the units and the surrounding area. And this relates to the distance to source. If you can eliminate the source, you can reduce the amount of spread that occurs into the unit. And so this is, I think, the most critical part. Make sure you know your unit, and not just along the roads, not just along the trail. It could just be somewhere on the interior. There might be one stump. It's you can't just survey 2,000 acres, 4,000 acres. It was a lot easier to survey 300 acres, but that wasn't necessarily easy. It took several days. But this is very important. Definitely survey the area. And know that it's hard to detect. It is really hard to find. Just because you don't see it on the roads doesn't mean it's there. If you do find it, I'm sorry to say, I cannot recommend to burn. I'll let you all do with that information as you will, but if you burn and there's Miscanthus around, it will spread. It will spread into the unit, if you want it or not. Think about the heavy equipment can be a vector. Not only does it create some of those those mineral soil conditions that facilitate Miscanthus establishment along roads, but it can also track in some of those species along the tread if they're not washed. Oftentimes, when I was working for a consulting forester in town, we would have the logger spray pressure wash their equipment before going on a new site that didn't have any invasive species. So that is important for Miscanthus, especially when you're bringing in dozer lines for a new prescribed fire unit or even for wildfire suppression. I know that's hard. And when you do burn, and this goes somewhat counterintuitive to a lot of what we're talking about, because a lot of the cool sites that we've been seeing burnt a little hotter and the herbaceous layer is coming back. But those higher severity spots are just more vulnerable to Miscanthus invasion. And so burning more conservatively and reducing fire severity it could reduce the speed at which Miscanthus establishes at least. And then after the burn, of course, survey it again. Because who knows if there was a little Miscanthus clump somewhere that would not have, that you didn't see beforehand because it wasn't flowering, it was just blending with all the other grasses. And then, of course, most importantly, if you find any clumps, treat them. And I think Jordan has done a lot of really good work working at DuPont, spraying a lot of the clumps there. And so that's really important. I know elimination is not really an option. That's why I think we're kind of past that. But we're getting towards the point at Green River where there's enough Miscanthus where you can't really find it all. But it's right before it gets really bad and you get that grass fire cycle takes over. When I was out there in 25 after the wildfire, I saw a lot of little things that looked awfully like Miscanthus, like little grasses. So it's really hard to tell when they're seedlings. It's much more easy to tell before they have spread. And so with that, I do want to thank my advisor for keeping me on for this long and putting up with me. It's really been a joy. Don is great. If you all know Don. He's right back there. Gonna make him blush. Rob Baldwin, Kyle Baird, Adam Coates, they're on my committee. They've been very helpful collaborators. Funding from CAFLS, Clemson University. Put that in last night. My technicians, Sam and Will, that helped me collect a lot of these data. The Wildlife Resource Commission and all the other partners that have been helping keeping this site going for so long and making this the important site that it is. Ryan Jacobs, Dean Simon, Jonathan McCall, thank you all for doing all the work, and all the other partners, Adam, Helene, keeping the site going. It would not be going without you all. So yeah, I'll, I guess, open it up for questions if you all want to fire.